Hello everyone. Have you ever read a headline and wondered who really wrote it? Not the byline, but the narrative itself, the subtle angle, the chosen quote, the fact that was conveniently omitted. Who decides what you see, and more importantly, what you don't? This question haunted the smoke-filled rooms and echoing corridors of post-war Washington, long before it ever became a public suspicion. My name is Arthur Donovan, and for a time, I was one of the men who had the answer. It began for me in 1953, a year drenched in the dual stenches of McCarthy's zeal and the ever-present low-grade fear of the atom bomb. I was a young reporter for the Washington Chronicle, hungry and full of a naive belief in the unassailable righteousness of the Fourth Estate. I'd done a tour in Korea, seen the world in shades of mud and blood, and returned home convinced that the only real weapon against the creeping shadows of totalitarianism was the bright, clean light of truth. My desk was a chaotic landscape of paper, half-empty coffee cups, and the percussive clatter of my Underwood typewriter. I was chasing stories about zoning disputes and minor bureaucratic scandals, all the while dreaming of the front page. Washington was a city of ghosts and whispers then. The halls of power felt heavy with secrets, and every man in a grey flannel suit seemed to have a second, unspoken agenda. The Cold War wasn't a distant conflict. It was an intimate presence, a chill that settled in your bones on a humid July afternoon. It was in the sealed documents carried by couriers, the coded language used over the phone, the way men would lower their voices in the corner of a dimly lit bar. My break, when it came, felt like a thunderclap. I'd written a series on logistical failings in the military's supply chain, using some of my own bitter experiences in Korea as a foundation. It was a solid piece of journalism, built on facts and figures, and it caused a minor stir at the Pentagon. It was enough to get my name noticed. A few weeks later, a handwritten note appeared on my desk. It was on heavy, cream-colored cardstock with no letterhead, simply inviting me to lunch at the Occidental. The signature was a single, indecipherable initial. Curiosity, the journalist's cardinal virtue and vice, got the better of me. The Occidental was old-world Washington, a place of dark wood, white tablecloths, and hushed conversations between men who decided the fate of nations over a plate of Chesapeake Bay oysters. I found him in a corner booth, a man who seemed to blend perfectly into the mahogany backdrop. He was perhaps 45, with a face that was remarkable only for its lack of remarkable features. He wore a perfectly tailored suit that didn't shout money, but rather whispered of quiet, established influence. He introduced himself as Mr. Sterling. He never offered a first name, nor the name of his employer. He simply smiled, a thin, knowing expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Donovan," he began, his voice a smooth, modulated baritone. "I enjoyed your series on military procurement. You have a talent for cutting through the chaff." I thanked him, feeling a flush of pride. He waved it away. "Patriotism takes many forms. We both served. You in the field, I in other capacities. We both understand the nature of the enemy we face. It's not just an army of men and tanks. It's an army of ideas. A virus of ideology that seeks to infect the free world." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. "The Soviets don't need to land troops on our shores if they can conquer the minds of our citizens, if they can turn our own free press into a weapon against us." He let that sink in as the waiter brought us water. The air in the booth suddenly felt thick, charged. He wasn't just making small talk, this was a prelude. "You believe in the truth, Mr. Donovan. So do I. But sometimes the whole truth is a luxury we cannot afford. Sometimes a particular truth needs to be given a platform, a spotlight, so that it might illuminate a greater danger. He took a sip of water, his eyes never leaving mine. There are men in this city, good men, who are engaged in a war you won't read about in the papers, a war of information. We ensure that the right stories are told. We provide context. We help dedicated journalists like you find the facts that matter. He made it sound like a civic duty, a higher calling. He wasn't asking me to lie. He was asking me to be a better patriot, to use my skills for something more significant than zoning disputes. He was offering me a seat at the table where the real game was played. He spoke of a network of like-minded individuals, journalists, academics, union leaders, all quietly working to fortify the nation against the insidious tide of communism. He called it a symphony of truth. He wanted me to be one of his violins. He slid a plain manila envelope across the table. "Just a tip," he said. "A union organizer at the docks. A few too many trips to Eastern Europe before the curtain fell. A few too many friends who subscribe to Pravda. Dig a little, see what you find. Whatever you write is your own, of course. We simply provide the starting point." I looked at the envelope, then back at him. My journalistic instincts screamed that this was a compromise, a corruption of everything I stood for. But another voice, the voice of ambition, of the young man desperate to escape the back pages, whispered that this was my chance. This was the door to the inside, the path to the stories that mattered. The choice I made in that booth, with the scent of old leather and political power in the air, would define the rest of my life. I picked up the envelope. Sterling's thin smile returned, this time reaching his eyes. "A wise decision, Arthur. Welcome to the orchestra." The weight of the manila envelope felt different from any other story I'd ever chased. It wasn't the thrill of the hunt, the piecing together of disparate clues. It felt pre-digested. Inside wasn't a cryptic hint, but a tidy typewritten dossier. It detailed the life of one Michael Strasser, a mid-level official in the Longshoremen's Union. It had everything: dates of his trips abroad, transcripts of speeches he'd given at union halls, a list of his known associates, some of whom were indeed members of the Communist Party USA. There were photostats of pamphlets he had written, decrying American foreign policy and calling for worker solidarity across international lines. On the surface, it was a reporter's dream. The legwork was already done. But as I sat in my apartment that night, a bottle of bourbon at my elbow, I felt a gnawing unease. The information was too clean, too perfectly packaged. It was a prosecutor's brief, not a collection of raw facts. Sterling's words echoed in my head. We simply provide the starting point. But this wasn't a start. It was a finished product, complete with a foregone conclusion. Michael Strasser was being presented to me as a threat to national security. I spent the next 2 days doing my own due diligence, trying to reclaim some semblance of journalistic integrity. I went to the docks, a world away from the starched collars of downtown DC. I spoke to the men who worked under Strasser. They described him not as a fire-breathing revolutionary, but as a tough, effective negotiator who had won them better pay and safer working conditions. They called him Mike. They said he was a family man. Yes, he had strong opinions, some of them radical, but he was one of them. I found a copy of one of his speeches. The dossier had quoted him saying, "The bosses in Washington and the commissars in Moscow are two sides of the same oppressive coin." The CIA's version had conveniently omitted the second half of that sentence. They were asking me to paint a man who distrusted all forms of unchecked power as a pawn of one of them. This was the fulcrum of the compromise. I could write the nuanced story, the one that portrayed Strasser as a complex, American-bred radical, a product of the Great Depression and Union battles, not a KGB agent in disguise. That story would be true, but it would be buried on page 17 next to the department store ads. Or I could write the story Sterling wanted. The story of a red menace infiltrating our vital ports. The story that would land on the front page. I told myself it wasn't a lie. Strasser did have communist friends. He did spout anti-government rhetoric. I wasn't inventing facts. I was merely arranging them in a specific pattern, connecting the dots that Sterling had so helpfully drawn for me. I wrote the article. I used the loaded language, the subtle insinuation. I highlighted his foreign travel and his association with known communists, while downplaying his genuine achievements for the Union. I framed his critique of American policy not as dissent, but as subversion. I turned Michael Strasser, the man, into Strasser, the symbol of a creeping threat. I filed it with my editor, a gruff, ink-stained veteran named Hap Reynolds. He read it, his brow furrowed, then he looked up at me over his spectacles. "Hell of a get, Donovan. Where'd you dig this up?" I mumbled something about a confidential source at the Justice Department, a lie that slid out more easily than I expected. The story ran on a Tuesday, on the front page. Below the fold, but the headline was big and bold. Communist ties at the waterfront. Union bosses' loyalties questioned. The fallout was immediate. A congressional committee announced an investigation. Strasser was suspended by the National Union leadership, pending their own inquiry. His name was dragged through the mud on radio broadcasts. I saw his picture in the paper a week later, leaving a hearing. He looked broken, a bewildered middle-aged man caught in a machine he couldn't comprehend. The men on the docks who had called him Mike now looked away when he passed. I had destroyed him, not with a lie, but with a carefully curated truth. The praise at the office was intoxicating. Colleagues clapped me on the back. Hap gave me a raise and a new beat. National security. I was no longer chasing zoning variances. I was in the big leagues. 2 days later, a package arrived at my apartment. Inside was a key and an address for a post office box. There was also an envelope containing $500 in crisp, untraceable $20 bills. More than a month's salary. There was no note. None was needed. I had delivered, and I had been rewarded. I felt a surge of triumph, quickly followed by a wave of something that felt a lot like shame. I went to a bar that night, a place where no one from the paper would see me, and I drank bourbon until Strasser's face finally faded from my mind. I told myself it was for the greater good. I told myself it was the price of influence, the cost of fighting a necessary war. But as I stared at my reflection in the dark mirror behind the bar, I knew I had crossed a line. I had stopped reporting the news and had started creating it. I was no longer a violinist. I was a willing instrument, playing a song whose composer I had never even met. The name of that composer, I would later learn, was Frank Wisner. And his orchestra was just warming up. The post office box became a silent conduit. There were no more lunches at the Occidental, no more direct contact with the ephemeral Mr. Sterling. The relationship was now sterile, professional. Every few weeks, a new tip would appear, a plain envelope containing another curated dossier, another set of dots to connect. And every month, a cash payment would be waiting. My career skyrocketed. I was the man with the sources, the reporter who could pull a story out of the ether that would dominate the news cycle for days. My byline became a mark of importance. Arthur Donovan on the front page meant something was happening in the hidden corners of the Cold War. The subjects varied. One month, It was a dovish State Department official who was arguing for cultural exchange programs with the Soviet Union. My article, seeded with information from the agency, painted his well-intentioned efforts as a naive and dangerous vulnerability, suggesting he was being played for a fool by sophisticated KGB handlers. He was quietly reassigned to a desk job in Bolivia. Another time, it was an emerging student movement advocating for nuclear disarmament. The CIA's file was thick with details on the supposed communist agitators who had infiltrated the group's leadership. I wrote a piece that transformed idealistic, scared college kids into unwitting pawns of Moscow, effectively poisoning the well of public opinion against them. The movement fizzled, branded as un-American. It was a subtle, insidious process. I was becoming an expert in the art of the smear, the carefully worded character assassination that left its target with no ground to stand on. How do you defend yourself against an insinuation? How do you fight a shadow? The agency, I had started thinking of them as the agency, a faceless, omnipotent entity, was brilliant at it. They understood that you didn't need to prove treason. You just needed to plant the seed of doubt. The cash payments grew larger, but the real reward was the access. Sterling had promised a seat at the table, and he delivered. I was invited to exclusive, off-the-record briefings at the Pentagon. High-ranking military officials and intelligence analysts, men whose names were legends, would speak to me with a candor that was intoxicating. They would lay out the global chessboard, explain the stakes in Guatemala, in Iran, in Vietnam. They gave me the big picture, and I, in turn, would write articles that perfectly reflected that picture, shaping public opinion to support the policies they were already planning to implement. It was a closed loop, a perfect feedback mechanism of power and propaganda. In 1954, they sent me to Europe. The official reason was a series on the Marshall Plan's success. The real reason was handed to me in a hotel room in Vienna. My new contact, a man who called himself George, was a stark contrast to Sterling. He was rumpled, academic, and smelled of pipe tobacco. He was less a spook and more a disillusioned professor. He explained that my role was twofold. First, I was to write the stories the agency wanted, glowing reports on pro-American politicians, dire warnings about the influence of local communist parties, features on the vibrant, free culture of the West versus the gray, monolithic oppression of the East. Second, and more importantly, I was to be a talent spotter. The agency was building a global network. They wanted me to identify foreign journalists, editors, and publishers who were friendly to the American cause and, perhaps more importantly, financially vulnerable. "Every man has his price, Arthur," George said, tamping down his pipe. "For some, it's ideology. For most, it's money. We just need to know who is receptive to a subsidy, a helping hand to ensure their publication stays afloat and their editorial line stays constructive." I was no longer just a writer. I was a recruiter, a paymaster. I moved through the cafes of Paris, the beer halls of Munich, and the press clubs of Rome. I was Arthur Donovan, the successful American journalist, a man with a generous expense account and an even more generous Rolodex. I would strike up conversations, gauge political leanings, and subtly drop hints about foundations and philanthropic groups that were eager to support anti-communist voices. If I found a promising candidate, I would pass their name to George. A few weeks later, I would hear that the journalist's struggling newspaper had received a mysterious grant, or that they were suddenly able to afford a new printing press. Their articles would soon take on a new, more stridently pro-American tone. I was meeting the other members of the orchestra. There was a syndicated columnist whose work appeared in over 100 papers, a respected television broadcaster, a publisher of influential magazines. We never acknowledged our shared secret. We would meet at embassy parties or international conferences, exchange a knowing look, a firm handshake. We were a fraternity, bound by a patriotic conspiracy. We called ourselves Mockingbirds, a cynical joke one of the older columnists had made. We repeated whatever song the agency wanted us to sing. The work was consuming, but it was also thrilling. I was at the center of the world, shaping events, not just reporting on them. The money, the women, the prestige. It was a potent anesthetic for my dwindling conscience. I had a tailored suit now, just like Sterling's. I drank scotch, not bourbon. I could silence the memory of Michael Strasser for weeks at a time. But sometimes late at night in a sterile hotel room thousands of miles from home, the silence would become too loud. I would lie awake and feel the intricate web I was a part of, its sticky threads stretching from Langley, Virginia, to every corner of the globe. I was helping to build a machine designed to manipulate public perception on a global scale. And I, like so many others, had been bought and paid for. The naive kid who believed in the clean light of truth was long gone. In his place was a man who understood that truth was just another commodity, to be packaged, marketed, and sold to the highest bidder. The highest bidder, in my case, was the United States government, and business was good. The deeper I descended into the web, the more I understood its terrifying efficiency. Operation Mockingbird wasn't a crude top-down command structure. It was a sophisticated ecosystem of influence. The agency rarely issued direct orders. Instead, they nurtured an environment where the desired outcome would occur organically. They didn't have to tell me exactly what to write about the new government in Guatemala. They simply had to give me exclusive access to a State Department insider who would passionately explain how President Arbenz was a dangerous communist puppet, threatening American interests and regional stability. This insider, of course, was a CIA officer from the Directorate of Plans. He would feed me meticulously prepared talking points framed as his own expert analysis. I would then write an influential column quoting a high-level source, which would be picked up by other papers. Soon, other journalists in the network, from television broadcasters to magazine editors, would start referencing my column. A single, planted narrative would ripple outwards, multiplying and reinforcing itself until it became the accepted truth. Congressmen would quote my articles on the House floor. The public, reading the same story from a dozen different trusted sources, would nod in agreement. And when the CIA-backed coup inevitably toppled the democratically elected Arbenz, the American people were already primed to see it not as an act of imperialist aggression, but as a necessary liberation. We were the echo chamber. My contact, George, explained the philosophy behind it one rainy afternoon in a London pub. People don't believe one voice, Arthur. They believe a chorus. When they hear the same tune from the respected columnist, the trusted news anchor, and the intellectual magazine, they assume it must be the truth. We don't create the truth. We create the consensus. And in politics, consensus is truth. This was the genius of it. It was deniable. If I were ever questioned, I could truthfully say that no one from the CIA had ever told me what to write. They had simply provided me with information, with sources. The editorial decisions were my own. My editor at The Chronicle could say the same. He trusted my sourcing. Each link in the chain was insulated from the next. The true nature of the operation remained hidden in the plausible deniability that separated us all. The network was vast and compartmentalized. I knew of maybe a dozen other assets, by sight or reputation, but I was sure there were hundreds more I would never know. There were the witting assets like me who knew exactly who we were working for. Then there were the unwitting, people who were being fed information by witting journalists or by CIA officers masquerading as something else. An academic might be convinced to write a paper for a think tank that was secretly a CIA front. A union leader might accept funding from a Foundation for Labor Rights that was established by the agency. They were all cogs in the machine, many of them completely unaware of the engine that was driving them. The financial arrangements were equally sophisticated. My cash payments were just one small method. The agency controlled a labyrinth of foundations, philanthropic organizations, and business fronts. They could funnel money to a magazine by taking out large, unnecessary advertisements. They could pay a journalist by offering them an exorbitant fee for a lecture at a university that was receiving agency funds. They could even purchase publishing houses outright through cutout corporations, giving them final say over which books saw the light of day. They were shaping the very intellectual and cultural landscape of the nation. They funded the publication of anti-communist authors, sponsored international art exhibits to showcase the freedom and dynamism of the West, and even had a hand in the production of Hollywood films, ensuring the good guys were always clean-cut Americans and the bad guys had thick Russian accents. One of my assignments was to act as a literary scout of sorts. I was given a list of European existentialist writers and asked to write pieces promoting their work in the American press. It seemed odd until George explained the logic. Sartre, Camus, their focus on the individual, on alienation, on personal freedom. It's the perfect philosophical antidote to the collectivist drone of Marxism. We want American intellectuals reading them, not Marx. We're fighting on every front, Arthur. Even the bookshelf. It was breathtaking in its scope. A war fought with typewriters, checkbooks, and cocktail party chatter. But the glamour and intellectual thrill couldn't completely mask the rot at its core. I was living a lie. My friends, my colleagues who weren't part of the network, my family, they all saw me as a paragon of journalistic success. They admired my integrity, my courage to speak truth to power. They didn't see that the power I was speaking to was also the one writing my script. The hypocrisy was a constant, bitter taste in my mouth. I remember attending a press conference where President Eisenhower spoke eloquently about the importance of a free and independent press in a democracy. I stood there, nodding along with the other reporters, my notebook in hand, while the weight of my last agency-funded paycheck felt like a lead ingot in my pocket. I was the very thing he was praising our nation for not having, a state-controlled journalist. The only difference was that my controls were invisible. My chains were made of gold and privilege. The worst part was the pride. A dark, twisted part of me reveled in the secret knowledge, the power. I would watch people on the street reading my column in the morning paper and feel a sense of godlike superiority. I knew the real story. I knew what they were being led to believe, and I was the one leading them. The naive idealist was dead, and in his place was a cynic. But even a cynic has his limits. And mine was about to be tested. The breaking point arrived not with a bang, but with a quiet, civil request. It came in the fall of 1956, a season of international crisis. The Soviets were brutally crushing the Hungarian Revolution, and the world was watching in horror. The agency was in overdrive, using the events to paint the starkest possible picture of communist tyranny. The narratives we were pushing were, for once, almost entirely aligned with the truth on the ground. The Soviets were monsters, and the Hungarian freedom fighters were heroes. It was an easy story to write. But the agency, as always, was playing a multi-layered game. While the main orchestra was playing a loud, martial symphony about Hungary, a smaller, more delicate tune was being composed for a domestic audience. I was summoned to a safe house in Georgetown, a charming brick townhouse that was as anonymous as it was elegant. Mr. Sterling was there. I hadn't seen him in person for over 2 years. He looked exactly the same, as if preserved in the amber of his own authority. He wasn't smiling. "Arthur," he began, foregoing any pleasantries, "we have a problem." A domestic one. He slid a thin file across the polished mahogany table. It didn't contain a dossier. It contained a single 8x10 glossy photograph. It was a picture of a man I knew. Senator Charles Porter, a thoughtful, respected moderate from a Midwestern state. I had interviewed him several times. He was a decent man, a war hero himself, known for his integrity and his cautious, deliberative approach to foreign policy. "Senator Porter," Sterling said, his voice flat. "He's becoming an obstruction. He sits on the Armed Services Committee. He's quietly raising questions about our budget, about the scope of our operations. He's talking about the need for more oversight. He believes the crisis in Hungary is a reason for caution, not for unchecked aggression. He's urging diplomatic restraint when we need to be projecting strength." I understood immediately. Porter was a problem not because he was a communist, or corrupt, or even naive. He was a problem because he was a responsible legislator doing his job. He was a check on their power. "What do you need?" I asked, my voice sounding hollow in the quiet room. "He has a daughter," Sterling said, ignoring my question. "Julia. She's a student at Bennington. Idealistic. She's involved in a few campus groups, peace organizations, that sort of thing. Some of which, as you know, have members we find interesting." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "We also know that the senator had a brief indiscretion a number of years ago with a staffer. It was nothing illegal, just unseemly. The woman is now happily married and living in Oregon. She has no desire to ever speak of it." He looked at me, his eyes like chips of ice. "We need a story. Not about the senator directly. We like him, officially. We need a story about the dangerous radicalism infecting our nation's youth, using his daughter's circle of friends as the prime example. And we need an anonymous tip to a friendly gossip columnist about the senator's past moral lapse. Nothing that can be traced back to us. Just enough to put him on the defensive. Enough to make him understand that if he continues to push, the next story might be more specific. We need to remind him that we all have vulnerabilities." I stared at the photograph of the smiling, decent man. This was different. Michael Strasser had been a faceless union boss with genuine ties to communists. The State Department official had been a nameless bureaucrat. But this was Senator Porter and his daughter. They weren't asking me to connect dots anymore. They were asking me to supply the poison, to ruin a good man's reputation and terrorize his family, not for any crime he had committed, but simply because he was doing his duty. They were asking me to use the tools of the KGB against a United States senator. All the justifications I had built up over the years, all the rationalizations about the greater good and fighting the Cold War, they all crumbled to dust in that moment. I saw the operation for what it truly was. Not a shield to defend America, but a weapon for a small, unelected group of men to pursue their own agenda, unhindered by the democratic process they claimed to be protecting. This was not patriotism. This was a silent coup. "No," I said. The word came out quietly, but it felt like a shout in the stillness of the room. Sterling's expression didn't change. He didn't seem surprised or angry. He simply looked at me with a kind of detached curiosity, like a scientist observing a specimen. "I won't do it," I said, my voice stronger this time. "There's a line. This crosses it. Sterling leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "There is no line, Arthur," he said, his voice soft, almost paternal. "You crossed it the day you took my envelope at the Occidental. You just didn't want to look down." He let out a long, slow breath. "I'm not asking you. I'm telling you. The story will be written. The information will be leaked. The only question is whether your byline is on the helpful framing article or whether your own indiscretions become the subject of someone else's. You've enjoyed the benefits of this arrangement for a long time. You don't get to suddenly claim moral high ground. You are one of us. Your hands are just as dirty as mine." The threat was no longer veiled. It was naked, brutal, and undeniable. My career, my reputation, everything I had built on this foundation of lies could be destroyed with a single phone call. They had files on all of us. They knew where we kept the cash. They knew about the affairs on overseas trips. They knew every secret we had. The web that had felt like a safety net of power and prestige was now a cage. I looked at Sterling's impassive face and I finally understood. I was a mockingbird, and mockingbirds don't get to choose their song. They sing what they're told, or they have their wings clipped. For good. The drive back from Georgetown was a blur. The familiar streets of Washington, usually a comforting grid of power and history, now felt like the walls of a labyrinth closing in on me. Sterling's words echoed with the chilling finality of a slammed door. "You are one of us." The illusion of choice, the comforting lie that I was a partner in this enterprise, had been stripped away. I was an employee, a tool, and I had just been given a direct order against which my conscience rebelled. For 2 days, I was paralyzed. I sat in my apartment, the senator's file on my coffee table, a silent testament to the crossroads I was at. I drank. I paced. I stared out the window at the lives of ordinary people, people who read the morning paper and believed what it said, and I felt a profound corrosive envy. I thought about quitting, just walking into Hap Reynolds' office at the Chronicle and resigning. But what then? The agency wouldn't just let an asset with my level of knowledge walk away. Sterling's threat hadn't been idle. They would destroy me. A story would appear, perhaps in a rival paper fed by one of my fellow mockingbirds. It would detail a pattern of fabricating sources or accepting bribes. My career would be over. My name, a permanent stain. They might leak details of my work for them, but frame it as me being a lone corrupt actor. They would cut me out and cauterize the wound, leaving me to bleed out professionally. The cage was perfectly designed. Any attempt to escape would only cause the bars to tighten. I thought about fighting back, about exposing the whole operation. But how? My word against a shadow organization with limitless resources and the full, unspoken backing of the state. I had no hard evidence. No documents with CIA stamped on them. Just cash I couldn't explain, and memories of meetings with men who had no official existence. I would be dismissed as a crank, a conspiracy theorist, or worse, a traitor. They would paint me as a disgruntled fantasist or a Soviet agent of disinformation. They could bury me. On the third day, I knew I had to make a call. I couldn't write the story they wanted. I couldn't be the instrument of Senator Porter's destruction. But I also couldn't openly defy them. I needed to find a third way, a path through the minefield. My first move was one of strategic surrender. I called my contact number and left a coded message indicating I would comply. A day later, I received the specifics. The name of the gossip columnist, a vicious, well-read hack named Alastair Finch, and the talking points for the article about radical youth. The package was a blueprint for a man's ruin. My plan was desperate, a long shot born of self-preservation and a flicker of my old journalistic ethics. I couldn't save Porter completely, but maybe I could give him a fighting chance. I wrote the article about the campus radicals, but I did it with intentional mediocrity. I followed the talking points, but I used bland language, avoided the most inflammatory accusations, and buried the lead. I made it a dull, forgettable piece of social commentary, not the sharp-edged weapon the agency wanted. It was a risk. They might see it as insubordination. But I hoped it would be subtle enough to pass, to fulfill the letter of my command, if not the spirit. The more dangerous part of the plan involved the gossip column. I was supposed to be the anonymous source, to feed the poison about Porter's old affair to Finch. I never made the call. Instead, I used a different set of skills I had acquired over the years, the art of the clandestine meeting. I sent a message to Senator Porter's chief of staff, a man I knew to be fiercely loyal and intelligent, using a cutout, a trusted contact from my pre-agency days. We met in a public park, sitting on a bench like two strangers. I didn't tell him everything. I didn't mention the CIA or the network. To do so would have been suicide. I framed it as a professional warning, reporter to source. "I've heard whispers," I said, not looking at him. "From the kind of people who trade in filth. They're going to come after the senator. They're going to use an old personal matter to try and silence him on the committee." I told him the specific details of the affair, so he knew my information was real. "And they're going to use his daughter's school activities as a way to paint him as soft on subversives. The attack is coming. I don't know exactly when, but it's been orchestrated." He was silent for a long time, watching his breath fog in the autumn air. "Why are you telling me this, Donovan?" he asked, his voice low. "Let's just say I believe a man's politics should be debated in the Senate, not his personal life in a gossip rag," I replied. "And I owe the senator for his service." It was a half-truth, but it was the best I could do. I stood up and walked away without another word. I had done it. I had betrayed my masters. I had passed a warning to the target. For the first time in years, I had used my position to protect a story, not to manufacture one. The sense of relief was immense, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, stomach-churning fear. I had thrown a rock into the hornet's nest. Now I could only wait to see if they would come swarming out. My bland article ran on a Thursday. I received no feedback, no praise, no criticism. The silence from the agency was more unnerving than any reprimand. Days turned into a week. Finch's column remained free of any mention of Senator Porter. The attack I had warned against never materialized. It seemed Porter's office had used my warning to prepare, perhaps by making a few quiet threats of their own to the gossip columnist's publisher. They had killed the story before it could be born. I had successfully sabotaged the operation. But my victory felt hollow. I had not escaped the cage. I had merely rattled the bars. I knew Sterling and his colleagues were not fools. They would analyze the failure. They would look at the weak article I had written and the leak that never happened, and they would know. They would know that the fault lay with me. My time as a trusted asset was over. I had broken the cardinal rule. I had chosen my own song. And now, I had to wait for the consequences. The silence from the agency stretched into a suffocating void. Weeks went by. The leaves fell from the trees, and the city settled into the grey chill of early winter. I went to work every day, wrote my stories, real stories this time, about budgets and policy debates, and waited for the axe to fall. Every time my phone rang, I tensed. Every time Hap Reynolds called me into his office, I expected the final fatal conversation. But nothing happened. It was a new kind of psychological warfare. They left me twisting in the wind, my own paranoia a more effective punishment than any overt action. I began to see shadows everywhere. The man reading a newspaper across the street, was he watching my apartment? The clicks on my telephone line, were they normal, or was it a tap? The network that had once empowered me now seemed like a ghostly web of surveillance. I saw my fellow mockingbirds at press briefings or social events, and their friendly nods now seemed menacing. Did they know? Were they the ones who would be tasked with writing my professional obituary? I was an outcast in a secret society, a pariah who still had to attend the meetings. My work at the Chronicle suffered. The fire in my belly, the ambition that had driven me to make my Faustian bargain in the first place, was gone. It had been replaced by a gnawing anxiety. The access I had enjoyed began to dry up. The high-level sources at the Pentagon and State Department were suddenly unavailable. My calls went unreturned. I was being subtly, quietly frozen out. The message was clear. You are no longer one of us. You are nothing. The final confrontation, when it came, was as anticlimactic and chilling as everything else about the agency. It wasn't Sterling who delivered the verdict. It was George, the rumpled, pipe-smoking academic I had worked with in Europe. He appeared at my table in a small cafe near Dupont Circle one afternoon, sliding into the opposite seat without an invitation. "Arthur," he said, his voice holding a note of what sounded like genuine disappointment. "You made a mess." "The senator was a good man, George," I said, my hands wrapped around a coffee cup for warmth. "He wasn't the enemy." "The enemy," George said, lighting his pipe with deliberate slowness, "is anyone who gets in the way of this country's survival. That decision is not yours to make. It's not mine either. We follow orders. You decided to become your own commander-in-chief. It doesn't work that way." He puffed a cloud of smoke. "Frank Wisner. He's not pleased. He feels you've betrayed his trust. He built this orchestra to play a symphony, and you decided to play a sour note. It's ruined the composition." He was talking about the real head of the operation, a name I had only heard in whispers. Frank Wisner, the brilliant, tormented architect of the CIA's covert action wing. To have earned his personal displeasure was a death sentence. "So what now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "You fire me. You expose me." George gave me a sad, weary smile. "Expose you?" "Arthur, that would mean exposing ourselves? We're not in the business of creating martyrs or congressional investigations. We're in the business of tidiness." He leaned forward. "There will be no exposé. There will be no scandal. Your career is not going to end with a bang. It's going to end with a whimper. In a few weeks, your editor at the Chronicle is going to get a call from a very influential friend on their board of directors. They're going to talk about the budget. They're going to suggest some necessary downsizing in the national security section. Your name will be at the top of the list. It's a shame, really. Such a promising young man, a victim of budget cuts." It was diabolically brilliant, clean, deniable. No one could ever prove a thing. I would be let go, given a severance package, and that would be it. Any attempt to cry foul would sound like the bitter rantings of a fired employee. "And what am I supposed to do?" I asked. "No other major paper will touch me after this." "I wouldn't think so," George said calmly. "Word gets around. Not about this, of course. Just that you're unreliable. Perhaps your talents would be better suited to a smaller market. A local paper. Something quiet. I hear the Des Moines Register is a fine publication. Or maybe you could write a book. A novel, perhaps. Fiction would be safest. The message was clear. I was being exiled, banished from the world I had so desperately wanted to join. I was to disappear, to become a non-entity. "Consider yourself lucky, Arthur," George said, standing up to leave. "In some countries, our counterparts solve these problems with an ice pick or a car accident. We're more civilized. We just erase you." He placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture that was almost paternal. It was for a good cause, you know. We are holding back the darkness. It's just, the things we have to do in the light are sometimes ugly. You weren't strong enough for it. Not many are. He walked out of the cafe, disappearing into the anonymous crowd. I sat there for a long time, the cold coffee in my cup mirroring the cold dread in my soul. He was right. I wasn't strong enough. I wasn't strong enough to resist the temptation in the beginning, and I wasn't strong enough to stomach the consequences in the end. 3 weeks later, it happened exactly as George had predicted. Hap Reynolds called me into his office, his face grim. He couldn't meet my eye. He mumbled about the board, about advertising revenue, about difficult decisions. He told me I was a hell of a reporter and that he was sorry to see me go. He handed me my final paycheck. I walked out of the Washington Chronicle for the last time, the clatter of the typewriters fading behind me. I was 34 years old, a ghost in my own life, erased by an invisible hand. The orchestra played on without me, its music shaping the world, and I was left in the silence. The years that followed were a long, slow fade into obscurity. I did what I was told. I moved away from Washington, away from the hum of power and the whispers of conspiracy. I took a job at a small newspaper in Ohio, writing about city council meetings and the annual county fair. The whiplash was severe. One day, I was receiving clandestine briefings about Cold War strategy in Southeast Asia. The next, I was covering a dispute over a new stop sign. The vibrant, dangerous, technicolor world I had inhabited was replaced by the muted, predictable grayscale of ordinary life. It was a kind of prison, a quiet purgatory designed by George and Sterling. I was free, but my name, once a mark of influence, was now a liability. A few times I applied for jobs at larger regional papers, but the doors were always politely, firmly closed. Word, as George had predicted, had gotten around. I was unreliable. I became a cautionary tale I couldn't tell. My exile was not without its own strange peace. The gnawing anxiety of living a double life was gone. I no longer had to carry the weight of state secrets or reconcile my actions with a dying conscience. The price of this peace was relevance. I was a spectator now, watching from the cheap seats as the history I once helped to shape unfolded without me. I would read the columns of my former colleagues in the network, men I had shared drinks and secrets with in foreign capitals. I could still hear the tune. I could recognize the talking points, the curated narratives, the fingerprints of the agency on the printed page. I saw Mockingbird's work in the coverage of the Bay of Pigs, where the press initially reported the CIA's cover story of a spontaneous uprising by Cuban patriots. I saw it in the framing of the conflict in Vietnam, where the domino theory I had helped popularize years earlier became the unassailable justification for a tragic, bloody war. I saw it, and a cold part of me felt a grim satisfaction that I was no longer a part of it, while another, more honest part, felt the shame of having helped build the stage for these tragedies. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the world began to change. The deference to authority that had defined the post-war era was shattered by Vietnam and Watergate. The counterculture I had once been tasked with discrediting was now ascendant. Journalists were growing more skeptical, more aggressive. and whispers of the agency's domestic activities began to surface. The name Operation Mockingbird started appearing in underground papers and radical magazines, dismissed by the mainstream as paranoid fantasy. But then came the Church Committee. In 1975, Senator Frank Church led a congressional investigation into decades of abuses by the U.S. intelligence agencies. I watched the hearings on my small black and white television, mesmerized. Names I hadn't heard in years were suddenly being spoken in open session. Frank Wisner, Richard Helms, Alan Dulles. The committee uncovered evidence of the CIA's mail-opening programs, their assassination plots, their infiltration of student groups. And they found the web I had been trapped in. The final report spoke of the agency's covert relationships with journalists and broadcasters, of using news organizations for both intelligence gathering and as outlets for propaganda. They confirmed that the agency had assets at major publications, that they had funded magazines and publishing houses, that they had secretly used reporters. It was all there, laid bare in the dry, official language of a congressional report. Mockingbird was real. I was vindicated. But it was a hollow victory. The report named no names. The full scope of the operation, the sheer number of journalists involved, remained a secret, buried under the guise of protecting sources and methods. The orchestra was never fully exposed. Only the existence of the conductor was confirmed. My old colleagues, the famous columnists and broadcasters, issued strenuous denials or claimed they were merely patriotic Americans sharing information with their government. No one was ever truly held accountable. The system protected its own. I thought about coming forward, about writing a memoir, about telling my story. But to what end? The world had moved on. The narrative had been set. I was a footnote to a history that had already been written, a ghost who had no credibility. Who would believe an obscure small-town Ohio reporter's decades-old tale of secret meetings and cash-filled envelopes? It would be dismissed as the ramblings of a bitter, failed journalist. The real damage of Mockingbird wasn't just in the individual lies it told or the careers it ruined. The true lasting legacy was the seed of profound distrust it planted in the American soul. Once the public learned that the press had been secretly working with the CIA, that the umpires had been on one team's payroll, the faith in the institution itself began to crumble. The operation was designed to fight a foreign enemy, but it ended up wounding the very democracy it was supposed to protect. It created the opening for the cynicism that would fester for decades, the corrosive belief that nothing is true, that every story is a conspiracy, that every journalist has a hidden agenda. We, the Mockingbirds, were tasked with fighting disinformation, and in the end, we became the architects of an era of institutional doubt from which the country has never fully recovered. I am an old man now. I sit in my quiet house and watch the 24-hour news channels, a cacophony of shouting heads and dueling narratives. I see the contempt for the mainstream media, the rise of partisan news sources that create their own realities. And I see the ghost of my past. I see the ghost of Operation Mockingbird. The methods are different now, faster, louder, amplified by technology, but the principle is the same. The creation of consensus, the blurring of lines between journalism and propaganda, the quiet shaping of the public mind. The orchestra is larger, the music more chaotic, but it is still playing a song composed by powerful, hidden hands. And I am left with the same question that began my journey, a question that is more vital now than ever. When you read the news, when you watch the broadcast, whose song are you really hearing? The world I helped create is now unrecognizable, yet hauntingly familiar. The technology has changed, but the fundamental desire to control the narrative has not. In my day, it took weeks of careful planning, clandestine meetings, and the slow, methodical process of printing and distributing newspapers to plant a story. Now, a single, potent lie can circle the globe in seconds, amplified by algorithms designed to reward outrage and extremism. The ecosystem of influence that the agency so painstakingly built in the 1950s has been democratized and weaponized by forces they could have never imagined. Foreign adversaries, domestic political operatives, corporate interests, and even lone individuals can now play the game that was once the exclusive domain of spies. They don't need a network of witting assets in newsrooms. They have social media, armies of bots, and a public already primed to believe that any information challenging their worldview is fake news. The distrust we sowed has borne bitter fruit. We were the original sin of modern American media. By secretly marrying intelligence operations with journalism, we shattered the sacred trust between the press and the public. That single act of corruption provided the justification for every future attack on the media's credibility. Every time a politician cries media bias to deflect from their own failings, they are unknowingly echoing the consequences of our actions. We gave them the ammunition. We proved that the conspiracy was, at least once, real. And in a world starved for certainty that one past truth can be used to validate 1,000 present-day lies, I often wonder about the men I worked with, the other mockingbirds. Some of them went to their graves as celebrated icons of journalism, their obituaries lauding their integrity and patriotism. Their secret died with them. Others, I suspect, lived out lives like mine, haunted by the compromises they made, forever looking over their shoulders. Did they see what I see? Did they recognize their handiwork in the fractured, chaotic media landscape of the 21st century? Did they feel the same cold dread when they saw history repeating itself, not as tragedy, but as a relentless, endless farce? Frank Wisner, the brilliant, tormented conductor of our orchestra, ultimately succumbed to his own demons. He suffered a severe mental breakdown, tormented by the moral compromises of the Cold War, and took his own life in 1965. He saw the monsters he was fighting and in the end, perhaps saw one in the mirror. His personal tragedy is a stark metaphor for the entire enterprise, a noble-minded crusade that descended into a self-destructive madness, consuming its own architects. My own life has been a long, quiet penance. I never wrote for a major publication again. I married a local woman, a librarian who knew nothing of my past life, and we raised a family. I found a measure of peace in the small truths of a small town. A well-run school board meeting, a successful charity bake sale, the honesty of a high school football game. I tried to use my skills for good, to be the kind of local journalist who holds a community together, not the kind of national influencer who tears a country apart. But the past is never truly past. It lives inside you. There are still nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, the face of Michael Strasser, the union boss I destroyed, floating in the darkness. I see Senator Porter's decent, worried face. I feel the weight of the envelopes filled with cash, the price of my soul. These are the ghosts that no amount of time or distance can exorcise. Sometimes my grandchildren will ask me about my time as a young reporter in Washington. I tell them sanitized stories, tales of press conferences with Eisenhower and the excitement of a big city newsroom. I cannot bring myself to tell them the truth. How could I explain that their grandfather, who taught them about the importance of honesty and integrity, was once a paid propagandist for a secret army? How could I explain that the history they read in their textbooks is, in part, a fiction I helped to write? My silence is my final, and perhaps greatest, shame. This account, which I have written and stored away with instructions to be released only after my death, is my only confession. It is not an apology, for what I did is beyond apology. It is not an excuse, for there is none. It is simply a warning. It is a testament from one of the men who was inside the machine, a voice from the grave cautioning you to question everything, to look beyond the byline, to ask who benefits from a story, to understand that news is not a product of nature but a manufactured good, and to always ask who is in the factory. The world is a symphony of competing narratives. My advice from a disgraced and forgotten violinist is to learn to listen for the discordant notes. Listen for the silence where a fact should be. Listen for the story that is not being told. The truth is rarely in the melody. It is often hidden in the spaces between the notes. My name is Arthur Donovan, and I was a mockingbird. And we are still singing. I write these final words from a hospice bed. The world outside my window a muted watercolor of greens and blues. The clatter of the underwood has been replaced by the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, a steady, metronomic countdown to my own final deadline. There is a strange clarity that comes with the end of things. The passions, fears, and ambitions that once drove me seem like artifacts from another man's life. All that remains is the stark, unchangeable ledger of one's own history. Looking back, I see the path that led me to Sterling's table not as a single misstep, but as a series of small, almost imperceptible compromises. It began with the hunger for a front-page story, the desire for recognition. It was nourished by a genuine, if naive, patriotism and a real fear of Soviet expansion. Each step of the way, I told myself it was necessary, that the ends justified the means. I was not a villain in my own story. I was a pragmatist, a soldier in a different kind of war. This is the most insidious nature of evil. It rarely presents itself as a monstrous caricature. It comes to you in a well-tailored suit, speaking the language of reason and necessity. It offers you a solution to a problem you already believe in. The poison is sweetened with patriotism. The cage is gilded with prestige. The CI did not have to hold a gun to my head. They simply had to know what I wanted and offer it to me. They were masters of human nature, expert in exploiting the universal desires for importance, for access, for the feeling of being on the inside. We, the journalists they recruited, were not just tools. We were willing accomplices. We traded our integrity for a seat at the table, convincing ourselves that we were serving a higher cause, when in fact, we were merely serving new masters. The Church Committee hearings in 1975 were a public spectacle, but they were not a cleansing. The agency and its allies in the press successfully framed the narrative as a case of a few bad apples and past excesses. The system was never fundamentally challenged. The idea that the American intelligence apparatus should have a covert relationship with the American press was not repudiated. It was simply pushed back into the shadows, to be conducted with more care and deniability. The true legacy of Mockingbird is the template it created. It demonstrated the profound effectiveness of using a supposedly free press to conduct domestic propaganda. It proved that you could guide public discourse, discredit dissent, and build consensus for controversial policies without ever firing a shot. This template has been refined and adopted by countless actors since. Political campaigns now operate with the ruthless efficiency of covert operations, using opposition research and targeted media plants to destroy rivals. Corporations hire public relations firms that employ the same tactics of narrative control and source manipulation to bury negative stories and promote their interests. The very concept of off-the-record briefings a staple of Washington journalism, is a direct descendant of the relationship I had with my handlers, a controlled dissemination of information to trusted assets who will shape it in a favorable way. We now live in a world where every powerful entity seeks to become its own CIA, its own Ministry of Information. The tragic irony is that the agency's original goal was to combat Soviet disinformation. But in adopting the enemy's tactics, they infected the host. They sought to control the narrative to protect democracy, but ended up teaching a generation of power brokers that controlling the narrative was more important than democracy itself. They created a perpetual motion machine of cynicism. I think of the young people today, navigating a media environment that is 1,000 times more complex and treacherous than the one I knew. They are bombarded with information from every conceivable angle, with no reliable curator to help them distinguish fact from fiction. The very idea of a shared objective truth, the bedrock of a functioning society, is treated as a quaint relic. They are the inheritors of the world we broke. My only hope is that this account serves as a map of one of the original fault lines. It is a reminder that the most dangerous threats to a free society often come not from foreign adversaries, but from within. They come from good men who convince themselves that their noble ends justify any means. They come from a quiet corrosion of principles, one small compromise at a time. Do not trust the singers. Trust the song. And if the melody seems too simple, too perfect, too aligned with the interests of the powerful, know that you are likely listening to propaganda. The truth is rarely a symphony. It is often a messy, complicated, and dissonant piece of music, and learning to hear it is the most patriotic act of all. The nurse has just been in to adjust my morphine drip. The edges of the world are getting soft. The beeping of the monitor seems to be slowing down. I have done what I can. I have filed my last story.